Hi, everybody. Welcome to this next session. Let me just click on very quickly, actually. So, new insights on old food safety problems. We've got a lot of information that we'd like to share. In fact, Julian, one of our colleagues, called it infogagement, is what we're looking for. In case we don't get through it all, we'd love to take questions or have conversations after the session. So please chase us down. We'd love to talk about stuff, especially over a cup of coffee. Here's the STAG membership, the Science Technology Advisory Group. We're here to give scientific advice to GFSI, and this is the membership of that group. And we've got a small selection of that group here today on stage, and most of the rest of the team you'll see around this week as well, so please stop anybody anytime. What would we like to talk about? Well, I think we'll all agree, and we've heard previous speakers say this as well, that recent years has kind of been incredible. The high-profile nature, the numbers, the seriousness, the impact of food safety recalls. And I put a few here, and you know, I could have chosen lots of others, and I could have chosen lots of other countries, but just a few that I think we've all heard about. So, Boar's Head, you know, and really what's the message there? The message is we got the basics wrong. We've got an outbreak of Shiga toxin-producing E. coli associated with burgers. And that takes us back to Jack in the Box in 1992, 93, I think it was. But this time, it's associated with onions. We've got Chronobacter linked to baby food in 2022, and it's been an ongoing issue for that industry about how to manage this risk. And Jeff will talk a little bit about how we understand risk versus hazard in this context. It's slightly different. You know, it's a different understanding that we need to have. And then I'm also very interested in this last one, which is a listeria outbreak associated with a UHT product. And it's a UHT plant-based product, dairy processing applied to a very different kind of non-dairy product, and the sorts of risks that might give. What I'd like to do now is just kind of introduce Francisco. Well, I've got to say, we've got a lot of information to get through, so we're going really quickly. Introduce Francisco, who's going to give some insights on what I've just been talking about. Thanks, Francisco.
Thank you very much, Dave. I appreciate that. This session, this is if you've been here at GFSI for the last 4 years, we've been fortunate that we've been part of it. We thank the steering committee for inviting us to this meeting. And for today's, we thought about what was going to be the theme of our presentation today. And one of them was to think about, the theme that came up in our conversations was to think about how what happened last year, it had impacted our perception about food safety. Over the entire year, as there were outbreaks happening, having conversations with different reporters, they kept on asking the question whether the sky was falling in the U.S. regarding foodborne disease, or whether the belief in the U.S.-centric mentality that we have the best food supply, whether kept on asking the question, do we have the best food supply? And we provided all sorts of answers. But anyway, today we thought it was going to be a good idea to have some sort of reflection how things happen. And I think it's important with the theme of Back to the Future, you always have to go back to history to learn. It's amazing how we go in cycles in many ways. So going back to history, to the last century, actually, it's interesting to remind us that the very first outbreak of E. coli 157 happened in 1982 related to hamburgers in a large fast food chain in the United States, 47 cases. And in the 80s, too, we had the first single listeriosis outbreak linked to frankfurters. And this was a very important case. It's not very known for many people that a single case actually was in the time of long before we had any fingerprinting methods. They were able to pinpoint a case in which frankfurters were directly linked to a single case of listeriosis. Then in 1993, we had a really large outbreak of E. coli 157, more than 700 people. And that was a case that was widely known. And in 1998, we had the first largest deli meat outbreak that happened in the Midwest of the United States that impacted multiple states, more than 100 cases, 15 deaths, and a really large recall that happened back then. Now, that took us to, as a result of those events, the USDA enacted a number of regulations. The first of them that I'm listing here, Listeria monocytogenes. First, as a result of that initial case of listeriosis in deli meats, was actually declared for the first time Listeria and adulterant in ready-to-eat meats. Then in 2003, there was the first Listeria rule in ready-to-eat meats enacted for using HACCP. And then in 2015, there was a new regulation on top of the HACCP with the 3 alternative regulations that we had in the US. For E. coli 157, similarly in 1994, that was declared an adulterant. And then in 1996, HACCP was mandated to be used in any USDA-regulated plant. Now, if you look at what happened as a result of this actions, you could see from data from the FoodNet, FoodNet Fast. If you look at the cases, clearly there was a decline that happened after those years following the adulteration declaration, and then also on the enactment of HACCP. So clearly there was some level of success that took place. And after those years, we started to see less cases of ground beef with E. coli 157 and less cases of listeriosis with deli meats. However, 2024 came last year, and we were very shaken to see that some of those similar cases that had happened many years ago were also happening then. We had the really large outbreak with listeriosis and deli meats, a very large recall that took place. And it's been really good to be talking today after seeing other presentations that have been referring to those outbreaks that happened last year. Similarly, in similar cases with listeriosis in deli meats, we also had one more outbreak last year from January to December. In this case, we're linked to Chinese-style ready-to-eat meats. And actually, in this case, similar to all the other outbreaks that have been seen before, we have actually been able to identify cases even before that the actual outbreak was observed. Now, let's do a comparison of what has happened between the listeriosis outbreak in 1998 and the listeriosis outbreak last year. The Frankfurter outbreak that was linked to the Sara Lee brand back in 1998. In many ways, very similar. The size, fortunately, there were less cases this in 2024. But the number of deaths were in proportion were a little more, but it was widespread. It lasted for months. In the case of the 1998, it lasted from June of 1998 all the way to February 1999. In the case of the Bratwurst outbreak last year, it lasted from May of 2024 all the way to November of last year. So that's helped us do some comparison that we are, again, seeing some of the same problems we had. And now, when we think about Back to the Future, think about both themes, both the old, or what we already knew before, and some new themes that we have been observing, and not just in 2024. We've seen many vehicles, novel vehicles of listeriosis, for example, that we have seen. But last year was not different. We saw cases of, as Dave referred, the 2020, from July to October in Canada, linked to a plant-based beverage. And then on top of that, we also had another case of a novel vehicle with associated with frozen supplement shakes, similar to the Blue Bell outbreak, And in this case, similar, that was affected a number of elderly people in long-term care facilities. So again, similar, once we had the outbreak identified, we were able to look back and cases way back all the way to 2018. Now, with E. coli 157, what happened last year, 2024, we had the old style of outbreaks. We had, ironically, we had a case of an outbreak of 140 cases, sorry, 104 cases, and unfortunately one death, associated with hamburger consumption in the same chain, fast food chain that happened all the way to 1982. Now, in Minnesota, and I give credit for the information from Minnesota to the Minnesota Department of Health, they investigated a regional outbreak in which 19 cases were actually reported resulting from consumption of hamburgers in a plant from Detroit, Michigan. So those are kind of you could say the old. And the new one is actually the same outbreak of E. coli 157 in hamburgers, but when we figure out that it was actually the onions, the vehicle of transmission of E. coli 157, that was really novel. We have heard about outbreaks with salmonella in onions before, a couple of large outbreaks in the past, but with E. coli 157 was the first case of outbreaks with an outbreak with onion. And last year, too, a new vehicle of E. coli, in this case, not necessarily 0157, 0121, but it was linked to organic carrots in as many in 19 states in the U.S. So that's kind of the new version of E. coli happening. Now, with E. coli 157, I want to just finalize my remarks on some of the latest data. I hope that you've seen the latest publication from Dr. Elaine Scallon-Walter with the latest estimates of foodborne disease in the United States. If you remember, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Scallon et al. 2011, in which they did an estimate of as many as 31 different foodborne pathogens. In this case, the analysis was restricted to 7 foodborne pathogens, and the data was the data they used was until 2019. My guess, I don't really know the explanation for that, but my guess is probably because they took data all the way before the pandemic in order to have a very, very consistent analysis. The pandemic affected quite a bit of the data. So in this graph, you can see that there are some of the latest estimates that we have here. For example, Campylobacter, the numbers have increased significantly compared to the previous estimate. And actually, it's the non-157 Shiga toxin E. coli that also has probably the largest increase in their estimate. So the message here is we're going to continue to see more and more E. coli 157, and this data in some ways is based on the graph that you can easily get out of FoodNet Fast on the CDC website, in which in this graph, I have shown part of the graph in one of the previous presentations, but in this graph, one of the increasing factors that we're seeing is now the presence of the non-157 STEC in the total cases, and as well as the impact of culture-independent diagnostic test, or CIDTs, and that's having a big impact on the numbers of Shiga toxin E. coli in the U.S. So to wrap up my remarks, before I wrap up finish my remarks, this is a really good graph provided by the Minnesota Department of Health that illustrates the shift in attribution regarding E. coli 0157. In the early years was predominantly beef and other meats, and now as we move to recent times, it's been predominantly leafy greens. But with the latest outbreaks last year, now we're having to have not only traditionally the romaine lettuce. That's been a major concern in the past 10 years. But now we have onions and we have carrots. So that continues to evolve. And the prediction is that will continue to increase in many ways. So let's just try to reflect on what happened last year and compared to what we've been seeing over the years. We go back to basics, and this is something I've already heard in a number of talks, is, for example, in the case of the boar's head outbreak, is the fact of sanitation and good manufacturing practices were missing or were fairly deficient at the plant. Now, on top of that, we're aware that given the information was released after the outbreak investigation, there was a failure in public and private inspection systems that they failed to detect and stop the production in the plant for months. And overall, we're shocked because this is the kind of cases that we thought we're not going to be seeing anymore. So we are basically witnessing a major failure in food safety culture. Now, one of the aspects that I'm going to wrap up here is One Health. We continue to talk about One Health solutions, but it's actually implementing One Health solutions are proving to be very challenging. And with the E. coli 157, that's an area that a number of groups in the U.S. are working very actively. Groups for example, the Western Growers Association trying to lead the effort in linking up with cattleman groups. And the first thing where we need to start is recognition that E. coli 157 is a zoonotic pathogen. It's carried by cattle mostly. And as long as cattle are the carriers of this pathogen, we will continue to see cases. Fortunately, the ground beef, they have not been as frequent, but any fresh produce will continue to be impacted. So One Health is, in many ways, the way to go. We need to get involved with multiple sectors. And in the case of cattlemen, that's one of the challenges that's proven in this, bringing them to the table, is the fact that they are not directly involved in most cases. So that's an area that I've been fortunate that I'm being involved, and there is a conversations led by Regan Udall Foundation for the FDA to bring all the different sectors to the table. So with that, I think I conclude my presentation, and I'd be happy to introduce my colleague, Jeff Farber.
Thanks very much, Francisco, and a real pleasure for me to be here today. I'd like to thank GFSI, and I also like to thank our fearless leader, Dave, who's been herding us through various talks over the last 4 or 5 years. So today what I'd like to do is shift gears a little and talk about a bacterial pathogen that you may not all have heard about or know about. So I'm going to talk about the new spotlight on Chronobacter in infant foods and really touch upon the differences, and we've seen this with other pathogens as well, such as Listeria, where some regulatory agencies may be looking at only taking a hazard-based approach to risk management and others taking a risk-based approach to risk management. So Chronobacter, our gram-negative bacteria, belong to that very big family, Enterobacteriaceae. They were actually originally described as these yellow pigmented Enterobacter cloaceae. And there's still issues actually with identifying Chronobacter, as we'll see maybe a little later on. But it was identified as Enterobacter sakazaki in 1980 and then renamed as Chronobacter in 2007. Story for Julian here for the infotainment. Steve Forsyth and I actually wrote a book on Enterobacter sakazaki. Came out in 2006, so I had a shelf life of about 1 year, Julian, and that was it for the book. And it is a little complicated, actually. If you look now at the literature and some of the regulatory agencies will look and they'll see Enterobacter sakazaki. So It actually, when you see it now in the older literature, it's actually could be any one of those 7 species of Chronobacter. It's not that clear actually in the literature. It's like other organisms like Listeria, very widely distributed in nature. In general, we feel that Chronobacter has a quite natural association with a lot of plants, soil, roots. So that's why widely distributed. I think one of the very unique features, it has a very good ability to tolerate high osmotic stress. So that's why you'll see it, I gave an example here, it can survive for long periods of time in a desiccated state. I gave one example here, 2 years, that's a minimum of 2 years. Some studies you see surviving up to 4 years in dried foods, low moisture foods. One example would be powdered infant formula. Okay, in terms of the sources of Chronobacter, I've mentioned this a little, but it's funny, you don't really isolate it a lot from meat, eggs, and milk, which we usually associated with Listeria or Salmonella or Campylobacter, but it is present in the wide variety of these low moisture foods, these grains, baked goods, flours, herbs and spices also have been found to have quite a high incidence of Chronobacter, and powdered infant formula, which a lot of these sporadic cases and small outbreaks of Chronobacter, as many of you know, have actually been linked to Chronobacter. Now, because of its widespread distribution, it can be found in many different environments. So in the hospital, we'll see some examples in the home as well, in food manufacturing facilities. Of course, that's where Chronobacter is getting into the powdered infant formula and other low moisture foods. Now, a very interesting study with regards to the home environments. Manpour et al. Found Chronobacter in about a quarter of US homes. And if you look at some of the data here, you can see entryway floors, 23% in entryway floors. Sweeping and vacuum dust, this is very common, not only in homes, but in factories, powdered infant formula factories, is a very good place to look for and find Chronobacter. Car mats, I have no idea why they looked at car mats in this study. Like I still can't figure it out if they were storing their car mats in the home or they went into cars. I have no idea. Kitchen sponges, 7%, kitchen sinks, 5.3. So you can see, wide variety of places in some of these homes. Okay, what about the virulence? We're often asked in regulatory agencies, wondering, all 7 species of Chronobacter, except for one, are capable of causing human illness. And the 2 that are most virulent are Chronobacter sakazaki and Chronobacter malnaticus. They form a majority of clinical isolates in all age groups. We're still trying to figure out, there are many different virulence factors that have been described in the literature. We still don't have a complete picture of how Chronobacter causes illness in infants and older adults. We also don't know what the minimum infectious dose is or the dose response is for infants. We've also seen that not all strains are equally virulent. But we do know that looking at some of the clonal complexes of Chronobacter, there is one particular one. We're not exactly sure why, this clonal complex 4, which is associated with a lot of the very severe neonatal meningitis cases. Okay, so what are the high-risk groups for Chronobacter? Now, a lot of people don't know you can get, and we do see quite a few infections in older adults, over 65. Now, a number of these adults are immunosuppressed in some manner, but there are some cases where they're not. So you can find it not only in infants. Now, when we look at the high-risk groups in infants, it is the neonates, less than or equal to 28 days, particularly those who are preterm and low birth weight. So those are the major identified group at risk of the highest mortality. The case fatality rate, very high for a foodborne pathogen, 20 to 40%. So that's why it's treated so severely when it's found in a powdered infant formula. The symptoms, generally in neonates, necrotizing enterocolitis, better known as NEC, septicemia, and meningitis. Okay, so Francisco set us up nicely for looking at old versus new. And so when we look at Chronobacter, It's not that new in the sense that there's been a number of outbreaks have been described back in the early to mid 1980s. Here you can see analysis of 8 cases due to Enterobacter sakazaki. Another one, intrinsic contamination of a powdered infant formula. So there were these outbreaks that people saw back in the 1980s. But moving ahead now, and this outbreak has already been mentioned back in 2020, moving ahead to 2022, 4 illnesses, 2 deaths in 3 states. And this was due to a product produced by Abbott Nutrition. So what was so special about this? Unfortunately, because of this small outbreak, there was a massive powdered infant formula shortage in all of North America. So basically, Abbott shut down actually their Michigan facility in February 2022. Abbott, as some of you may know, is the largest U.S. infant formula manufacturer, provides around 40% of the U.S. infant formula supply. And just some figures, as a result of the plant shutdown, the national out-of-stock rate for powdered infant formula increased from 18% in January to 43% at the beginning of May, and reaching 70 to 80% in some states near the end of May. So as a result of this, the FDA came up with this national global strategy, how to deal better with Chronobacter, how to deal better with shortages in the future. We won't have time to go over all, but these are just some of the initiatives and some of the, for example, in the middle, some of the guidance documents, for example, sanitation programs for low moisture ready-to-eat foods, and that includes powdered infant formula. Operation Stork Speed recently announced. So they're looking at a whole wide variety of initiatives to try to prevent any of this from occurring in the future. But moving ahead and trying to again deal with shortages, we almost had a massive shortage of infant cereal in North America. So what happened in this case is that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency in Canada had sampled infant cereal. They found actually 2 different brands that contained Chronobacter. But again, this goes to the hazard versus a risk-based approach. In this case, finding Chronobacter in infant cereal, is that really a risk? The questions that came up, is there a food safety basis for the recall of such products if Chronobacter species are detected? Is there a risk basis to support the regulatory testing? If you don't know what you're going to do when you test something, why are you testing it? So some of the factors that we're working with the companies and some of the regulatory bodies. So factors to consider besides the epidemiology when assessing whether the mere presence of Chronobacter, so just a hazard, in infant cereal represents an unacceptable risk. And you have to look at many other factors. So for example, we know that there's a very strong correlation between the age of an infant, where most of the severe illnesses occurs in the neonates less than 28 days. But infant cereals are generally marketed towards weaning infants, 6 months of age. Sometimes you may see it at 4 months of age, but the pediatricians don't recommend solid foods, introducing solid foods till about 6 months of age. And this age group also, as many of you know, gradually becomes exposed to many different types of bacteria in the foods that they eat when they're over 6 months of age. So where are the cases, and some of you know this in terms of what you've maybe dealt with in the past, cases where a hazard does not equate to a risk. So for example, most recently, we saw this with SARS-CoV-2, where the mere presence of infectious agent may be on a frozen product we felt did not equate to a risk, and we published this ICMSF. We did with Lucia, also a nice paper looking at hazard versus risk with SARS-CoV-2. The presence of low levels of Clostridium botulinum in foods in the environment occurs routinely, but for the most part, that hazard does not equate to a risk. The last one, I guess, could be a little controversial depending on the regulatory agency, but foods which do not support growth containing low levels of LM, we feel pose very little risk, although there are some regulatory agencies globally that still only take a hazard-based approach to listeria. So if they find listeria in a sunflower seed, they'll still recall basically listeria, looking just at a hazard and not a risk-based approach to the control of the pathogen. So conclusions from my portion of the talk. I feel there's really no risk basis to support the regulatory testing of infant cereals for the presence of Cronobacter, and no food safety basis for the recall of these products. In this scenario, which I've described, the potential hazard Cronobacter is widespread and actually can be found in many different environments and foods. Although there have been some cases of Cronobacter causing illness in infants greater than 6 months of age linked to consumption of powdered infant formula, we have not seen any cases at all with Cronobacter linked to infant cereal. So in this situation, we feel the presence of a hazard in the food, which are marketed to older infants, does not equate to a risk for infants greater than 6 months and even greater than 4 months of age. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to my colleague Kay now.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And so it is my job to wrap up some thoughts on this Back to the Future session, some thoughts to leave you with. It is a great pleasure to be here and to, for me, a home gig, and you should all feel very honoured to be in Dublin on a sunny day. So it is great to see it at its best. So we have talked a lot, and Jeff and Francisco have clearly demonstrated we really can never rest on our laurels when it comes to food safety and assume that, okay, everything is sorted now. But the tools that we now have at our disposal really are helping us to make these challenges easier to tackle. The more knowledge we have, the more we can understand our processes and where vulnerabilities can be. So we can really consider that knowledge is power. We can't hide our heads in the sand. So things like sequencing. These advances that we have seen in the last 10 years have been game changers for us, whether that be an outbreak investigation, but also for things like environmental and ingredient monitoring. The development of data repositories at a global level and open source analytical tools allow us to interrogate and compare our isolates with those from different regions, sectors, One Health domains. This allows us to have a much greater understanding of how these pathogens are, where they're coming from, how they're evolving, and how we can tackle them. We've also moved beyond just looking at our pet pathogen. There's an expression that no man is an island, and indeed none of our bacteria live in isolated communities either. They live in multi-species communities. Now we want to understand these communities and how these influence each other, these dynamics between different species. Can we harness that knowledge to be able to provide more targeted controls? And the only way we can do that is by looking and understanding where these organisms are coming from and how we can better tackle them by more fully understanding them. We also know that the risks are dynamic. Anyone that is involved in in food production knows it is a very fast-paced, constantly moving business. And we need to also acknowledge that our risks are constantly changing. For example, if we think about climate change is changing the way we are producing our foods. How is that going to impact on things like pathogen growth, pathogen transmission? What about the presence of chemical contaminants such as mycotoxins? How are we taking that into consideration in our risk management? As we look to the ingredients that we put into our foods, or we look to provide alternatives, different dietary substitutes, how do these changes influence our product safety and shelf life? Can we use the same process, or do we need to make changes to ensure that we are providing food safety assurance? As we look to more sustainable food systems, trying to be more energy efficient, how does that influence our products? and the safety of them. Each of these factors, everything along the whole chain, and we have seen throughout today already how complex these systems can be. Each element can influence the risk profile of a given product. So we need to be constantly looking to each change that we make to ensure that it isn't impacting on the overall safety of our product. Because as we have seen, while we think we sometimes have solutions to the products, these guys can always come back and surprise us again. With that, I will conclude. I would like to thank all my STAG colleagues and indeed you for your attention. And we now welcome any questions from the audience. Any questions from anyone? See you.
Microphone. Is there a mic in the back?
Nope. There's one on the way.
Okay, we'll repeat the question.
He's coming.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Lucia Anelich from South Africa, Anelich Consulting. I just want to thank the team for bringing up these really important points about revisiting these pathogens as such. And one of the areas that I really want to commend on is this issue around hazard versus risk. It is something that's been a passion of mine for some time, but what I would like to say is the developing world looks at the developed world for guidance for these kinds of things. And unfortunately, sometimes what occurs because of this hazard-based approach rather than a risk-based approach trickles down to countries, for example, in Africa. And the regulators and the scientists don't necessarily understand the difference. And they will implement exactly what is occurring that is potentially unnecessary recall for the fact that there's a hazard, but it's not necessarily a risk. And in my country, and I've spoken about this a lot, and I think Jeff alluded to that because he knows this very well, is because of the listeriosis outbreak in 2018 in South Africa, which killed 218 people, and 1,065 cases occurred. Our Department of Agriculture took a typical knee-jerk reaction and decided to want to implement a regulation to make Listeria monocytogenes in raw poultry and meat absent in 25 grams, and implement a pathogen environmental monitoring program with zoning in poultry abattoirs. I don't know how many of you have been in a poultry abattoir. It's not a sterile environment, not even close. So this is something we're fighting at the moment, and I'm leading this process for the poultry industry in South Africa at the moment with the Department of Agriculture to try and stop this from going through because it makes absolutely no sense. And this is a typical example of what can occur. The other issue I remember some time back was Chronobacter in bread rolls in the US, and that was a recall. Again, why? Because babies don't eat bread rolls, right? So these are the kind of things that the developing world sees and thinks, oh, that's a problem. We've got to do the same, without the thought process that goes behind it. So I really would like to appeal that we interrogate these things a little more and perhaps be a little bit more careful in the types of decisions that are made at both industry and regulatory level when it comes to these kind of issues. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Jeff, I don't know if you want to comment?
Yeah, thanks, Lucia, for bringing up a very important point. And we often don't think of the ramifications to developing countries of some of the standards and guidelines that we do set. But I think, we all at least in Canada as well, trying to turned to Codex Alimentarius, which tries to set the standards for, over 160 nations. And so maybe there needs to be stronger emphasis within, some of the developing countries in adopting, if they don't have standards, to adopt the Codex standards as, in their countries. But you're right, it's like, listeria is a prime example, like you mentioned, like when I started working on listeria, and I won't tell you, way back in the 1980s in the lab, when we wanted to get isolates of listeria, we would go to ground beef and ground poultry. That was a great source of listeria. So, it's all over. You have to recall basically your whole supply, basically, of ground beef and ground poultry for listeria, but that's a great example.
Do you have any other questions in the audience?
Yeah, there's one over there.
Thank you. Louisa Biomy, Natural Resources Institute, University of Greenwich. To what extent do you think some of these problems are as a result of food safety culture or lack of it? Thank you.
That's a really good question. I think I would say that a good share of some of those outbreaks may have a really big role to play, not a strong food safety culture, that's for sure. We, in the last few years, we have recognized that's a critical component that probably we've been missing, and I think it's critical to reinforce. What's the extent of contribution? I would think that in cases like the boar's head outbreak, I would say probably had a big impact. In the case of the onions outbreak, I'm not sure whether I know that there were some evidence that lack of sanitation in the packing plant for the onions, but I think it's hard to put a specific contribution of food safety culture. But I think everyone agrees after this past year that this is an area that is urgent to continue to make progress, to really have an impact in preventing foodborne disease.
Yeah, just to add to that, we had a large outbreak in Canada, listeriosis outbreak due to maple leaf meats, deli meats. And in terms of the culture, and it's a great question, because the culture of the organization was when they found a positive, they didn't want to report it upwards. So none of the senior management, nobody knew about all these positives. And when, I guess Michael McCain, you may have heard, in terms of when he was the president CEO, when he found out that they weren't reporting up, he went berserk, and he totally changed the company. And every time after that, they set up a system. Every single positive that they got was reported up, and the whole management team almost every day would be looking at the positives of listeria that they got in the plant. So food safety culture took over, but unfortunately, only after 24 people died.
And if I may just add to that, I think even in the best run organizations, you have quality problems. Even with what you think are all the right systems in place, things go wrong. And I think the mark of a great culture is that when it does go wrong, you immediately respond appropriately, you investigate properly, you share those learnings, you bring in the right expertise, you talk about it around the organization. You don't try and bury it under the carpet, you talk about it. And as a result of that failure, you improve what you do so it doesn't happen again. And I think if you can learn from these things, that's a great measure of a good quality system. But any system has issues. But just to underline, I think what my colleague said here, particularly with food safety, it begins with culture. You've got to care. If you don't care, you shouldn't be in this business.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question.
A great point, Dave. We have time for maybe one more question.
Okay.
Yep. Or we do not have time.
I thought we had 48 seconds. I think we're done.
With that, I would like to say thank you all for your attendance, and thank you all. It's been a pleasure.